the West Australian Government Railways X-Class. I received a handful of requests from Australians wanting me to talk more about their country, and okay, I'll pick some more bad locomotives from you guys. And you're welcome, by the way. I'm sure this is exactly what you meant. Anyway, the Class X, which is a name that I actually adore, was a diesel-electric built between 1954 and 1956 by Bayer Peacock and Company as well as Metropolitan Vickers. In that era, like a lot of places, diesels were fairly new to the rail line, so this was kind of an experiment to see how well they would go. And in Class X's defense, it did serve for quite a long time and is considered really successful, but not because it was any good, because failures on it commenced within weeks of the locomotives first being released. In the early years of their use, the steam locomotives that were still on the rails had much higher availability when compared to the Class X. The engines had a habit of burning and leaking oil, their bearings were underfed, their heads and pistons popped and vibrated all over the place, and they suffered from ring scuffling for most of their lives. The only reason why the Class X lasted as long as they did was that the Midland Railway workshop staff worked their butts off keeping them in line, trying to work out the kinks and make them function. And when all was said and done, over 600 design faults, mainly with the Crosley engines they were using, had to be overcome. Honestly, had these diesels been in place at any other location on the planet, they probably would have been scrapped well before any kind of fixes were put into place. Because, let's be fair, over 600 design faults, that's a lot of problems. Like, a lot of problems. I don't know how you messed this thing up that bad. But to its credit, the last one was withdrawn in 1988, so they served for over 30 years. So that's not bad, all things considered. And 6 of them are still in preservation. They're often referred to as submarines by rail fans, but apparently the WAGR always called them hummingbirds, probably because of the noise they made. The Australian Standard Garrett, or ASG. Yep, sticking with Australia. You asked for it. You asked me. You asked me to talk about you, okay? Don't yell at me. You wanted some representation, I'm giving you some representation. It just happens that the first time I'm doing it is on a list of really terrible locomotives, but don't worry, you can't outdo British Rail. It's not possible. In 1939, the Australian government formed the Commonwealth Land and Transport Board to take responsibility for the country's land transport networks, and that included the railways. The thing about the board is that they had the power to override decisions of the state railways. It sounds like a bit of government overreach, but the idea was to keep things more consistent. The CLTB appointed a new commissioner of railways in Western Australia, whose name was Joseph Ellis. Ellis recommended that Garrett locomotives be purchased for the railways. However, the CLTB didn't want a medium or heavy version of a Garrett, they just wanted the light so it could operate on any narrow gauge line in Australia. Not every railway was happy about this arrangement. The Queensland Railways, for example, were vocal opponents, preferring a more traditional style steam locomotive. But in the end, they were overruled, and the Australian Standard Garrett was put into production. It was built in a record-breaking 4 months, entering service in 1943. Only 57 were ever built, and that was because the CLTB was partially put into place because of World War II. When the war ended, the need for extra locomotives was minimized, so they didn't have a reason to make any more, at least at that point. But a major issue with the ASG is that, as the name might imply, Australian Standard Garrett, this was meant to be a standardized design that could help standardize all the railways all across Australia. But the problem was, there were many differences between the various states and railway networks, including loading gauges, sharpness of curves, axle load, and especially in Queensland, so the design wound up being very compromising, not necessarily standard. For example, their solution to make sure the long wheelbase could negotiate sharp curves, the leading driving wheels were designed to be flangeless. A flange is a lip. Those little divots you see on most train wheels, those things. Now, why would this help it negotiate tighter curves? Well, since there were no flanges, it meant that the wheel was able to teeter off the rail a little bit, with much greater flexibility on tighter curves. And that has been utilized on locomotives, but in this case it proved to be a major flaw, because the locomotives had a rather constant habit of derailing every time they went to turn, or go over a point, or really any time they just felt like it. The crews also hated them, because the firebox door opened flat on the floor of the driving cab. Not only is that just really inconvenient, but it also maximized heat radiation into the crew compartment. This meant that they were super uncomfortable to work on. Most of them didn't last past the mid-1950s, however, a few were resold to Emu Bay and Finesford Cement Works Railways. They were actually a bit more successful for them, probably because they're shorter lines with less tight curves. The only complete ASG that's still around is G33, which worked for Finesford Cement Works Railway until 1957. It was on site display until May 2013, when it was moved to Bellarine Railway in Queenscliff, who wanted to fully restore it to operation. As far as it'll tell, it hasn't happened quite yet, but they are still working on it, so you might be able to see one of these run again. The Baldwin DR-12-8-1500/2, which is also known as the Centipede, which is what I'm going to be calling it, because I'm not saying that long number code more than I have to. The Centipede was Baldwin's first serious attempt at a road diesel locomotive, and it was a bold one, attempting to be cutting edge and distinctive when compared to other diesels that were being made available in the late 1940s when they were built. The prototype set did a tour run on some American railroads, and they did see a few orders from Pennsylvania Railroad, Seaboard Airline Railroad, as well as National Railways of Mexico. But the problem was that the Centipedes were obsolete by the time they were even being produced. They were behind the times. The other problem is that Baldwin kind of missed the mark when it came to designing a diesel, because I'm sure you've probably already noticed why people call it a centipede. And that's, why in the blue heck do they have so many friggin' wheels? And I can happily explain this. Baldwin essentially, quite literally, designed the wheel layout like a large steam locomotive. Under the AAR, they'd be 2-D plus D-2. But under the white notation, which usually isn't used for diesels, but I'm going to use it for this one because it's actually way more appropriate, these are 4 884s, giving them the same wheel layout as big boys, with 4 leading wheels, 8 driving wheels, followed by 8 driving wheels, followed by 4 trailing wheels. The problem is diesels just aren't done in this manner. That's a steam locomotive layout. There was no reason to have this many wheels on it, or in fact unpowered wheels at all on a diesel locomotive. It served no purpose, and it made maintenance an absolute nightmare. Maintenance is already hard enough on car body style diesels, but with this many extra axles, it made working on them and fixing any problems they had quite a pain in the butt. Baldwin also manufactured them like steam locomotives, and by that I mean they did not use common assembly lines with standardized procedures like with modern diesel manufacturers. No, they built them one at a time, like steam locomotives, the result of which was that each centipede was actually slightly different from the next centipede that was made, meaning that the wiring and equipment was often in slightly different spots between units, making even routine maintenance that much worse. They were not considered very successful, and although Pennsylvania Railroad gave them an honest try, eventually they were only relegated to helper service, and all of them were scrapped by the late 60s. It's kind of sad, to be honest, because I do like that they're distinctive. They get your attention, and they look neat. But looking interesting doesn't necessarily mean they are interesting. And the fact was that Baldwin's design ethos when it came to these things was completely outdated, and they were never gonna work. The British Rail Class 84. I'm not speaking to you. That's how I feel about the situation now. You want attention. I'm not giving it to you. You're like a spoiled child. Don't sit in the corner. Think about what you've done to deserve this, while I think about what I've done to deserve this. Ugh. The Class 84 was manufactured between 1960 and 1961. Only 10 were made, and these are not actually diesels, which is a bit of a shift, I know, but it's still 60s and it's still British Rail, so you probably know what's about to happen. These were electric locomotives, built for the electrified lines on the British Rail network. And let me tell you, the Class 84s are probably one of the worst examples of an electric locomotive that British Rail ever delivered, because they had a problem. And to be fair, a lot of them built at this time had the same problem, because they used mercury arc rectifiers, which were used for converting high voltage AC into direct current, or DC. The problem was that the mercury arc rectifiers were repeatedly prone to malfunction and complete failure. And in 1962, the first one, E3036, was returned to GEC, who made the electrical equipment used in the things, so they could try to find a solution. By 1963, the rest were all out of service for the same problem, and the problems persisted until '67, where they were just kind of placed into storage. The 84s probably would have been scrapped at that point, but British Rail did an extension of the West Coast Main Line's electrification to Glasgow, and that meant they needed more electric locomotives. There weren't enough Class 87s, which were actually pretty good, in order to do the job, so the 84s wound up being one of a handful of electric locomotives that British Rail opted to rebuild in the early 70s in order to replace their mercury arc rectifiers with silicone rectifiers. Silicone rectifiers were much more reliable, and in fact every other class that had this overhaul done wound up being pretty successful once the rectifiers were changed out. Except the 84. For whatever reason, the 84 still had persistent problems, even after being given the new silicone rectifiers, and by 1980 they were all withdrawn from service. A few were used as bank testers, or some experimentation with the electric systems, but in the end they would all be scrapped with the sole exception of 84001. It was preserved by the UK's National Railway Museum, and is actually currently on loan to the Scottish Railway Museum. 84001 is actually very special as a preserved piece of rolling stock because it is the only surviving example of a mainline post-steam locomotive that was created by North British Locomotive Company. There are a few small shunting locomotives from them still around, but this is the only big mainline one. So even though they were a complete pain in service, you have to give 84001 this. It's now a solid piece of railway history, and that's something to be proud of at least. Budd SPV-2000. Ugh. These are diesel multiple unit rail cars built by the Budd Company. No, not the beer, this Budd Company. And it was not the first time they had built a diesel multiple unit rail car. Their popular rail diesel car, or RDC as they called it, was actually quite successful. And SPV-2000 was supposed to be the successor to that, and it was not. It was horrible. It was a disaster. They were just unspeakable garbage, and I usually don't say that, even about bad locomotives, but really, the 2000s are just so bad. I say that as an American. Mind you, the Budd Company is from Philadelphia, so I'm allowed. They were built between 1978 and 1981, though only 31 were actually produced, plus 14 unassembled shells. Why was that? Well, from the get-go, these cars may look a little familiar to you, and that is because Budd straight up used the Amfleet passenger cars from Amtrak as the shells for their rail cars. Now, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that decision. I mean, those are nice passenger cars, don't get me wrong, but they weren't designed to be power units. And apparently Budd completely threw any kind of quality control out the window because these are some of the worst rail cars ever produced. They failed at every single possible chance they got. They were so bad that a 1982 New York magazine even called them defective. Their power units just never worked, ever. People called them seldom powered vehicles, and often when they were used, they were just being pulled by a traditional diesel locomotive. And to be honest, that's how most of these things wound up. Eventually, they were just converted straight back into Amfleet passenger cars, and some of them are still being used like that today. Although two of them did wind up somewhat in preservation. Number 293, formerly Metro North Railroad, is currently at the Connecticut Eastern Railroad Museum, and apparently Conduct 1001 is being restored by the Danbury Railway Museum, which is also in Connecticut. Don't know why Connecticut likes these rail cars, because they were awful, but hey, you know, preservation, history, I'm fine with that. It's just something I find weird because I hate these things. They are so terrible. They're just, God. So with that, till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.